Hello everybody, my name is Boulevard and welcome to Tournament Tactician. No camera this week, don't worry about it, it'll be back next week, I promise, but we're going to be going over the tournament tier list as we do in every episode of Tournament Tactician. Now, the Jace cards have not been tiered. Obviously it's sort of the most exciting thing to happen this week, but I've been taking sort of a wait-and-see approach on these things rather than tiering them and luring you into a false sense of where they would end up. So instead we're just going to take a normal approach. I'm just going to run down the tier list because things have been pretty stagnant for a little while, and while it'll be exciting to see if Jace shakes things up, I just want to give you a quick refresher. This is going to be a very short Tournament Tactician because we don't have enough information on Jace. The seasonal is still 2 weeks away, so next week we'll have Jace information and we'll be going over that a lot and focusing on that, and then the week after, of course, will be the massive, big, important tournament tier list right before the seasonal. You don't want to miss that one. So right now we still have the three major players, Scion, Sivir, Gangplank. Now if I had to rate these in terms of like strength and popularity, probably put Sivir Demacia at number 1, Gangplank Dex at number 2, and then Draven Scion at number 3, with Plunder showing up a lot more than Bandle Pirates will, mostly because Plunder does beat the Bandle Pirate deck, as well as it does a lot better into Sivir Demacia, and that's why you're seeing so much Plunder, and then, of course, Sivir Demacia and Draven Scion still just very strong decks. Again, the new cards were really only Piltover and Zon, and I don't think any of them are going to fit into Draven Scion, so we shouldn't see really any shakeup among the big three that have just kind of been running the format for quite some time. Then, Darkness Control, a deck that I have been big on. Does this belong in Tier 1? That is debatable. I'm going to keep it up here because I think that if you know how to play Darkness, it is very much a Tier 1 deck, and it'll be winning tournaments. But I do want to emphasize, like, you will probably not see a Tournament 1 without at least one of these top 3 decks in it, and then everything else is kind of flex. But Darkness I am still pretty big on. I think that a good counter to the meta that we're in is Control, and we've seen players have success with triple Control lineups last weekend at the Online League Series, so it'll be interesting to see how Jace falls into that, because I do think that the most refined Jace deck at the moment is the Jace Ladros. You're really like sort of traditional Piltover and Zon Shadow Isle Control, more of the Sentinel build like the Decimate Scathus pile from the previous format, but we'll get into that a little bit later. And then Shellfolk. So Shellfolk got a little bit of an update. The Wobbly Wombats have been hard at work refining this deck, and their day one progress seems to have actually been cutting Vi entirely for Fizz. And I have a link to the list here. It plays the new Landmark, where when you play a 10 cost spell, or a 6+ cost spell rather, it's just mostly Glorious Evolution, you will refill your spell mana, and you also get that 3/3 on play. So that's a nice little defensive tool, but I do recommend checking this one out. And then Lux Poppy Shellfolk, the Demacia version, rather than the Piltover and Zon version. Again, you can run both of these together because there is no champion lineup, or champion overlap, rather, and there is no regional overlap. So we've seen quite a few players running both the Lux Poppy Shellfolk and the Fizz PNZ Shellfolk. I did want to mention that at last week's Online League Series, both finalists ran Lux Poppy Shellfolk as well as Sivir Auction, so like definitely the decks that are doing well. And then their third decks were Darkness and Bandle City Swain. So, Shellfolk still doing very, very good, kind of walking that line between, like, doing well into a lot of the meta, as well as being not quite a control deck, more of a combo finisher with a little bit of stall is really what they're looking to do. Just, like, play removal in the early game, play the Glorious Evolution if you're the Fizz style, and then kill you, and the Lux Poppy version is a little bit more mid-range oriented. It looks a little soupy. But it's a deck filled with a lot of micro synergies. There's no like big macro synergy where you're like, oh, this is the play that I'm looking for. It's just like a lot of nice little like 2-card combos, if that makes sense. So that's Tier 1. These are the things that are performing very well in tournaments, and then I'm on some Darkness Copium still. I'll be on Lee Sin Copium when the seasonal gets here, but it's not quite here yet, so Lee Sin's staying down there. Tier 2, Bandle City Swain. Again, this deck just keeps popping up, but not en masse. It's being played by very few players. They are having success with it. They are winning tournaments with it, or at least getting the finals of tournaments. Swain Teemo is really just like a good deck, and we're all going to have to accept that. I don't think it's going anywhere. The refinement really hasn't been like happening, so to speak, that I think the deck is just like very solid. One thing I do want to call out about it, and this is sort of just a meta call in general, is I think we should be playing Aloof Travelers more. When you look at the high end of this meta, like, you're not seeing as much Scion as you used to, so that, like, one deck that Aloof is not very good against isn't really popping up. Against the Poppy decks, it hits rallies. Against the Glorious Evolution decks, it hits Glorious Evolution, which is really big. Even against Lux Poppy, it's pretty likely to hit mini-morphs and things like that, which can matter if you're running like Bandle City Swain, where you have this Leviathan that you need to protect from the mini-morph, or whatever expensive card they might have you. Again, with Jace being a deck that people are going to be at least trying out this weekend. Not only are there a lot of like big impact 6-cost spells that you want to hit, but the most expensive the most expensive card rather in at least the Jace Ladros version is going to be like Commander Ladros and Ruination, and these are cards that you would very much like to hit. I just think that every deck has really high impact aloof targets right now, and while I understand the initial fall off of aloof travelers because of the nerf on the stats, I think it's time that these PNZ decks start really thinking hard about putting aloof travelers back into their deck, at least for tournaments, because the tournament meta is very narrow comparative to the ladder meta. So I do think that like aloof travelers is just in a very good spot, and it should be run more than it currently is being run. We've seen it start to like trickle back into the meta. I want to see it come in full force. If you are playing PNZ or Bandle City, I want to see you on aloof travelers. Then we get into Spooky Viego, another strong deck, just kind of keeping the pace. Spooky Viego plays differently than pretty much any other deck in Runeterra, and it's a hard strategy to adapt to for that reason, and that's why it continues to see success. Bandle Pirate's the second best Gangplank deck, that's why it's so good. Lee Sin, again, one of the highest skill cap decks in the game, but not really run so much at these grassroots local tournaments. Will probably be up in Tier 1 by the time we get around to the seasonal, and again, you can preemptively prepare for that by putting more aloof travelers in your deck, because the Lee Sin decks have stopped running Scattered Pod because that was a pseudo protection for aloof, on top of the fact that Solari Priestess just seems a little bit better now with the 2/2 stat line, so Lee Sin is more vulnerable to something like the aloof travelers. And then like Bandletree kind of falling off a cliff for the meantime, but again, I think we're going more towards a control-oriented meta, and that would incite a resurgence of Bandletree. Elusive Rally is kind of the boogeyman of the ladder, but it's been kind of getting dealt with. The meta has adapted. Shellfolk, from the Shellfolk experts' perspective, is very good in 2Z Poppy. So, again, just one of those things to take into consideration. This is, like, not where your aloof is getting value, but, you know, you can still hit those rallies. But enough of the aloof talk. It's just, like, a popular deck. Poppy is easily, like, the 4th best champion when we're talking about, like, the big 3 being Scion, Sivir, Gangplank. Poppy is, of course, a flexible spot. You will probably see Poppy at the very worst of the finals of any given tournament. It might even end up being Lux Poppy, but like, hey, Poppy's still in there, just like a generically good champion, but the rally and burn decks aren't doing as well as you'd kind of want them to. Like, they're still good. They're still obviously very good. I mean, look at the other decks in here. Like, they're on par with like Bandle Pirates and Bandle City Swain, which is like winning tournaments. So like, yes, Poppy is still very good. I've kind of narrowed down the tier list to really only talk about decks that I think are like very good. I took Lurk off because Lurk has just kind of fallen off a cliff. It's good matchups aren't really here anymore. But Poppy, I don't want you to look at tier 2 and say, oh, this is like a fringe deck, I'm not going to see it. No, like, Poppy is still very good. I just don't think it's on the level of some of these tier 1 decks. And yeah, that's kind of where the Darkness Copian comes in, right? Because who would actually put Darkness over Poppy? That's like maybe a plot hole in the tier list, but it's one that I'm going to overlook, and you don't have a choice but to overlook. And then Ziggs Poppy, you know, it's fine. Ziggs Poppy does very well into every other Poppy deck, so as Poppy decks start to, you know, sort of decline in popularity and play rate and win rate, then Ziggs Poppy falls off a little bit. Like, it's still very solid into other decks, obviously. It's probably one of the best burn decks in the game, but that doesn't mean much. I don't think it's necessarily in a better spot than like burn-oriented Scion with like Decimates in the main, Captain Farron and all that. But if you were going to play like a triple aggro or like triple burn lineup, yes, I very much think that you would include Ziggs Poppy in that. Now that we've kind of got an idea of where everything falls, I want to talk about the Jace decks. So Jace Heimer, Jace Lux, Jace Ladros, these are the ones that I've been seeing experimented with the most. Jace Ladros is obviously going to be the best one on the opening weekend because it had a dedicated shell already in the Sentinel control. I'm talking like Demacian Sentinel, Buru Sentinel, and just like sort of your stock PNZ Shadow Isle control list. PNZ Shadow Isle control tends to do very well at the start of a meta and then fall off pretty quickly and pretty harshly. We all remember how hard everybody was on concurrent timelines Ladros, even though it was bad for the game. That's why it got nerfed. It wasn't because of the power level of it necessarily. So again, I think Ladros is going to do the best on the opening weekend. It's the deck that players are going to be the most comfortable on, and there's just a few diehard PNZ Shadow Isle control fans out there that are looking to play this deck pretty much any chance they get. From here, things get a little wonkier between, like, what's better, Heimer or Lux, because I don't think players have really figured out, like, what they want the second Heimer region to be en masse yet. And again, these are decks that play very differently than other decks in Runeterra. As soon as you introduce a mechanic like Jace, where you are playing with 6+ mana spells, that, like, we're not seeing dedicated Lux decks, right? Like, Lux Poppy is the only thing that's coming close to doing well, and that's more of a Shellfolk deck. It's not like a dedicated Lux deck where we try to pump out as many Final Sparks as possible. And I think Jace is going to run into a similar thing where we just have to figure out, how good the Jace package is and what the Jace package actually looks like. What is the minimum number of cards that we need in order to have Jace be the most effective in-slot champion? And does that look better than something else that we could be doing? Because on the surface, Jace 1 does look like sort of just a worse Vi in a lot of scenarios. So it's going to be a little bit of doing before we get that refined. Now, I'm confident that Jace will be refined for the seasonal, but here on the opening weekend, I really think Ladros is the only one that you're going to be seeing performing well. Now, I wouldn't be upset if I was wrong about that, but it does just seem to be where the stats are lying. Jace Lux might be just a little bit too copium, a little bit too all-in on trying to make Lux a good champion and just, like, making this really bricky pile with a lot of 6+ cost spells in order to make Lux and Jace function. I do think Jace Heimer is going to be very good, and even if it's not Jace Heimer, I think just Heimerdinger is going to do very good. I think that the card that he got out of the new set is very effective for the archetype and what it wants to be doing. But again, I've said this before, I'll say it as many times as I need to for new listeners and old listeners alike. Heimerdinger is a hard deck to build, and it is going to take more than 3 days to figure out what the best Heimerdinger deck looks like. And the worst Heimerdinger deck, which is probably what we have now, is probably not something that is going to win a tournament. But the refinement will happen. Next week, we'll have a much better idea of what the Lux and Heimer variants of Jace, or even a new Jace variant, looks like. And those will start to perform very well. But on the opening week, if I had to tier it, I'd put Jace Ladros probably in tier 2. I'm very optimistic for it because I am, again, very confident for control into this meta. And then the Lux and Heimer, you might see them win a tournament, but it's more of just you kind of got lucky than you had the best deck. You know what I mean? Not to, like, discredit anybody that does end up winning with these, but, like, I think that the list that they end up running, like, let's say Aikado, right, just as an example, because he's a player that I'm big on right now. Let's say Aikado comes in with a Jace Heimer deck and wins a tournament this weekend. If Aikado decides to run Jace Heimer at the seasonal, I imagine it will look a lot different than whatever his tournament winning list looks like. Does that make sense? That's what I'm trying to get at here. So anyway, that's about it. That's all I kind of wanted to get into, give you guys a refresher on the tier list, why everything is tiered where it is, point out this plot hole. Please don't bully me on Twitter for it. Speaking of Twitter, you can follow me on Twitter at casterboulevard, where I will be tweeting about this tier list, the link to it, so you can check out all these sample lists as soon as the video goes live. And don't forget to sign up for the Online League Series X Mobilytics tournament. That is happening in 2 weeks. This week, I believe the Bandle Gunners Duos Cup number 2 is happening, and that is Europe only. I do not think there is an Americas tournament, but I could be wrong. I'll do a little bit of digging before this goes live, and if I find one, I will put it in the description below. If you see this video and there is no link to an Americas tournament and you know of one happening, let me know. I can edit the description and put it in. But anyway, yeah, sorry about no camera this week. Thank you for sticking around for the rundown while I kind of get everything situated. And then again, on Monday, I will have an article about the tournament weekend for Giant Slayer. Check that out on my Twitter or their Twitter, at Caster Boulevard. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. My name is Boulevard, and as always, good luck in your tournaments.